particular character showed up, some kind of Frankenstein guy. Some name him as a Frankenstein. Why it is important for you that we clearly understand why Trump is a symptom of the system's evolution.
Well, first, thanks for everybody who chimed in there, and I think probably many of us feel all of those things at different points in any given day. I know I do. It's hard to be any one thing these days, and I know I feel a huge range of emotions just reading the news every day. But I think as the young woman who said she felt enthusiasm illustrated is that the best way to get out of our pits of despair and hopelessness is to get in rooms filled with other people who are doing things to change the world. That's certainly the only thing that ever works for me. And it's the only thing that is one of the things that I love about being a journalist, is that I have an excuse to go around immersing myself in movements and people who are on the front lines of all kinds of life and death struggles, and they always put things in perspective. I felt this real sense of urgency to put Trump in the context of neoliberal history, in the context of the rise of corporate power that I've been documenting for a long time, and in the context of a worldview that is based on domination of other people, based on race and gender and sexuality, based on physical beauty and bizarre standards thereof, and based on domination of the earth itself, a worldview that is based on limitless taking, grabbing. I call him the grabber-in-chief. You know, he grabs women, he wants to grab the oil, he wants to grab everything with a total sense of entitlement and impunity. So he's an exaggerated version of the worst that our culture produces, but he is not outside the culture. And I have to say, you know, when I come to Europe, I don't want to reinforce feelings of European smugness, you know. One of the things that I think is most dangerous about Trump is that he lowers the bar so much that everybody looks good in comparison to Trump, you know? And that can really reinforce a sense of complacency. You know, I'm Canadian, I'm dual American and Canadian citizenship, but you know, I know that in Canada, our Prime Minister dressed up as Superman for Halloween, as you may have seen. It takes very little to look like Superman these days, let me tell you. You just have to not be Trump. So it was important for me to put Trump in context, because I saw a lot of people using this word shock again and again to describe him, describe everything he did. And I know from my previous work on shock, and you know, many of you read the shock doctrine, that when we are in a state of shock, we are very vulnerable. That shock is the gap. This is the way I define shock. It's the gap that opens up between event and narrative. It's the gap that opens up between something that happens and our ability to understand that event. That we go into shock. And that is when we are at our most vulnerable. And I think Trump is very good. He's like a shock machine at keeping us in a state of shock. And lots of political commentators thrive off this narrative that this is totally unheard of, right? And it's incredibly dangerous because of the moral relativism that sets in. And if we've never seen this before, then of course George W. Bush is a great guy. I mean, haven't we all seen his reputation be resurrected? So these are some of the reasons I wanted to put Trump in context, mainly to get us out of shock fast so that we can strategize. He's a global phenomenon. It's not just that we're all impacted by what he does on climate change or nuclear war, we are. But also he's part of a global phenomenon that looks different in every country. Marine Le Pen is not the same as Donald Trump, but they share some traits in common. And there are versions of Trump and Le Pen in every country right now that are rising because we are in a global world that is impacting us all differently, but impacting us all, right? And so we need international strategies and international conversations to confront that.
Actually, to put Trump into this context, referring to your first book, No Logo, we were talking about holo brand and how from the 80s and 90s brand conquer new spaces. Could you explain, share with us how holo brand is occurred to describe the Trump phenomenon?
Right, so what No Logo was about was not just corporations marketing themselves a lot, right? No Logo was about this change that happened in the corporate world in the 1990s when this mania took hold in the corporate world which shifted the structure of the multinational corporation from the traditional one of companies seeing themselves as producers of products and deliverers of services that they branded and marketed to differentiate themselves from their competitors, to seeing themselves primarily as manufacturer of ideas, lifestyles, identities, right? For which the products were largely incidental. So the company that really that really led the way on this shift was Nike. They were the first product-based company that didn't own a single factory, right? They outsourced absolutely everything. And they said, we are not a running shoe company. We are not an athletics company. We are a company about the idea of transcendence through sports, okay? And because they didn't own any of their factories, they were able to spend much more money than their rivals on marketing, and they produced the best marketing the world had ever seen, right? But if we think, so they're hollow in the sense that they had divested themselves from their manufacturing base. And this is relevant to Trump and Le Pen and all of the right-wing populists because, of course, part of what they're tapping into is the anger of that deindustrialization, right? The irony with Trump is that he participated in it as a hollow brand himself, right? So, like Nike, Trump's act of manufacturing is not building buildings. He started out that way. He used to be a traditional real estate developer. But in the 90s, well, really not in the 90s, in the early 2000s, when he got this reality show, which was the most incredible marketing campaign of all time, he realized that he could now become a hollow brand, which meant that his act of manufacturing was the act of projecting the Trump brand into the world, and then he could sell the Trump brand to other people to build buildings and golf courses and resorts, right? So his act of manufacturing is just creating the mythology around his brand, selling the idea around his brand. That creates value that he then profits from by selling. People pay him for the privilege to put the Trump name on their buildings, right? So it's a different business model. And like Nike, you know, in order, you know, the argument I make in No Logo is that you can't understand this phenomenon without understanding the age in which it rises up, right? It's parallel to the rise of neoliberal economics and the fact that many of the institutions from which we used to get our group identity, our sense of belonging, which is very important to us humans, were under attack, under assault by the neoliberal project, which was telling us all we were as consumers, that everything public and communal was suspect and was under attack in various ways, right? So then the companies come back and sell us that idea of belonging, that need for belonging through shopping. But of course, we don't ever really get it, right? I mean, when we get the running shoes, we don't get transcendence, you know, and when we get the laptop, we don't get revolution. And so we have to shop some more. So it's a perfect formula for capitalism because it keeps us in a constant state of need, right? Of unfulfilled need. And that's fabulous. That's economic growth. That keeps the cycle going. But in order to really embody an idea, if what you're selling is a latte or a laptop or a running shoe or a golf club membership, what you need to do is co-brand with something else in the culture. You need to devour something else in the culture that actually does embody those things, right? So that's why Nike needed to co-brand with Michael Jordan and needed to co-brand with all of, every professional sports league in the world, right? Well, Donald Trump's brand is being the boss, being the all-powerful boss who's so rich that he's living this dream of absolute freedom and impunity. That is what the dream he is selling, okay? And that's always been what he's selling. And it's a particularly seductive dream, once again, in the era of neoliberalism, when more and more people are leading precarious lives and the world is cleaving more and more into this society of losers and winners, right? So you better make sure you're a winner. So Trump's brand has always been about saying, give me money, buy my book, or, pay for this fake university, Trump University, or become a contestant on The Apprentice, and I will turn you into a winner. That's the promise of all of his, products. And so that's the dream, that he can, when he said on that Access Hollywood tape, that they let you do it, right? If you're a celebrity, that in this age where people feel so disempowered, he had this absolute freedom, right? And so he has co-branded with the US government. And in a way, the US government's brand is also impunity, right? Absolute power, world's biggest military, makes the rules, breaks the rules, signs a climate agreement, breaks the climate agreement, creates the International Criminal Court, won't send its people to the International Criminal Court. I mean, it's kind of a perfect synergy, right? Trump and US empire. And the parts of the US government that in any way compromise with that or soften that idea of impunity, he's doing away with, right? So they're firing diplomats right, left, and center. They're not interested in the parts of foreign policy that are not just about the military. And he surrounds himself with generals and so on. So this is the hollow brand, nuclear armed, yeah.
But actually, it's not just an episode with one character, with Trump. Actually, you mentioned that it's a global corporate coup with this election. Could you describe why?
Right, so there's the Trump brand, right? And then there's this other brand that he created called Make America Great, MAGA. And it has, baseball hats and it provides this sense of belonging. It's not a joke. He really is creating this kind of tribe of sense of belonging, this team around this idea of restoring this nostalgic idea of America, of pure dominance, particularly seductive to white men who feel that their status is being taken from them, right? In order to sell that product, it actually is not a completely hollow product. There were some very specific things attached to it, including bringing back well-paying jobs, bringing back fossil fuel jobs, bringing back factory jobs, bringing back jobs that paid a middle-class salary, protecting healthcare, protecting Social Security. He ran a very anti-neoliberal campaign. Being so rich that he didn't need to take money from Goldman Sachs. He was free from the influence of other corporations because he was so rich. That was his ridiculous sales pitch. And that he was actually going to clean up Washington because he knew how corrupt it was from the inside, right? So he did make that pitch, and he mixed it up with racism, he mixed it up with misogyny. That was not his only pitch, but that was a big part of his pitch. And so he is vulnerable on this because he has staged what I call the local corporate coup. What he has done is so diametrically opposed to what he ran on in economic terms, right? He immediately turns around, appoints this cabinet of billionaires and multimillionaires, 5 former Goldman Sachs executives after attacking Hillary Clinton and Ted Cruz for being in the pocket of Goldman Sachs. He has lobbyists running the government at every level. He has the former CEO of Exxon running the State Department. I mean, it's beyond parity in terms of the clash between what he campaigned on and what he's doing, including denying people health care, including attacking people's Social Security. this tax plan that they've just introduced, which is a huge giveaway to corporate America, is going to create another very large hole in the budget. They're debating about how big a hole it is. Is it 1.5 trillion or is it 5 trillion? Whatever it is, it's going to have to be paid for with more cuts, right? To the people who elected him, impacting those people directly. So this is why I say it's a corporate coup, because what he is doing is so different from what he campaigned on.
And facing this massive celebrity with Trump, some people say that the only solution would be to have other celebrities, such as Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, or Oprah Winfrey. But you are quite critical about this approach.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, what I try to do in the book is sort of map a few of the roads that led to Trump, right? And I think one of the roads that led us to this really absurd situation where Trump could stand before American voters and say, sure, I have absolutely no experience in government, I have no idea, what I'm doing, but vote for me because I am a billionaire. And because I made so much money in real estate, that means that I can transfer that knowledge to government. That was his pitch. It was very simple. And so what I think is important for us to understand is that this equation of great wealth, often ill-gotten wealth, with great wisdom in all areas is not an idea that Donald Trump pioneered. It's an idea that if we're looking, for its roots, I think Bill Clinton played a pretty significant role in it through the Clinton Global Initiative, which was this sort of quasi-UN. It was people would say that the Clinton Global Initiative had become more important than the UN General Assembly. And there would be this parade of billionaires, including Mark Zuckerberg and Richard Branson, who I wrote about extensively in This Changes Everything, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett. They would all get together and sort of volunteer to fix the world's problems. And with very little accountability. The case that I write about in This Changes Everything is when Richard Branson went to the Clinton Global Initiative and announced that he was going to spend all of the profits from his airlines and transportation businesses to solve climate change. And he was going to spend $10 billion to solve climate change. This was heralded as the single greatest act of philanthropy in history. He was on every single talk show. He was, the greatest hero of all time. I looked into it, and he spent the tiniest fraction of the money. Meanwhile, he massively expanded his airline fleet, his carbon-spewing airline fleet, in the intervening years. But, the point being that we used to think of these as problems that we solve together as citizens through our democracies, and now Bill Gates has more power over global health, over pandemics and African agriculture than the World Health Organization, than the FAO, because of the money he spends. And also, there's this expertise issue. Like, he knows a lot about software, but why do we assume he knows so much about African agriculture? Why do we assume he knows so much about public education? He has an insane amount of influence. So, no, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg is the answer to the problem of Donald Trump. I think he's a symptom of the same problem, and that is fundamentally a crisis of democracy. And once again, I don't think this is just an American phenomenon. I mean, even if we think about the COP that was held in Paris a couple of years ago, I mean, we had that same parade of the prospect that the billionaires are going to solve this for us through some technological fix.
For the moment, the design of our democracy is based on election, and so there is this question of popularity and populism. You were in favor of Bernie Sanders. Could you describe why you decided to support Bernie, and what is your position around popularity and populism?
Well, I mean, I think this phrase populism means very different things in very different contexts. Like, there's a very progressive history of populism in North America. It's not a dirty word the way it is in Europe. So I'm not sure it's the most helpful word if we all mean different things by it. Like, I think I believe in democracy, so I'm not suspicious of things that are popular, right? And just because they're popular. And I wasn't didn't support Bernie because he was popular. I was surprised by how popular Bernie was. I was surprised and delighted because this was a truly surprising turn of events for those of us who've been on the left for a long time, to see this man, a democratic socialist, a self-described democratic socialist in the most capitalist country on earth. And when Bernie, I've known Bernie for years, and when we were on a panel together shortly before he announced, and it was clear that he was, going this route, and we all thought, well, good for Bernie, this will be interesting, he'll get some issues on the agenda. We never imagined that he would win 22 states, that he would win 13 million votes, that he would have rallies of, 10,000 people. It was an absolute phenomenon. And it was very important, because we spend a lot of time talking about the frightening things that are happening on the right side of the political spectrum. In this country, Germany, all over the place. And there are very frightening things happening with the normalization of ideas, the growing acceptability of ideas that would have been unsayable just a few years ago. And they're also impacting the centrist parties. And we're seeing that in the abhorrent treatment of refugees in Europe, with centrist parties responding to the far right in ways that, taking positions that we would have only attributed to the very far right just a couple of years ago. But there's also something happening on the left side of the spectrum, if you'll forgive the left-right dichotomy. I know that's very passé. Where ideas that would have been, seen as completely marginal, like to say in the U.S., free college tuition, that would have been a bit like an outrageous idea. But Bernie ran on that idea, also erasing debt for college students. He also ran on a campaign to get to 100% renewable energy very quickly, to have no new fossil fuel leases on federal lands, which I know is a debate that's happening now in France. It's even more significant in the United States because it's a major fossil fuel producer. What else? Universal public health care, and all of these ideas that during the neoliberal era were considered unsayable were particularly for millennials. They were hearing many of these ideas for the first time, and they just thought, this sounds great. So the campaign picked up all of this momentum. It was not a perfect campaign. I'm proud to have supported Bernie. I think he did something absolutely remarkable. But he didn't win. He didn't win the primaries. And the reason he didn't win the primaries, there were many reasons, and we're learning more every day about the extent to which the Hillary Clinton's campaign controlled the Democratic Party. Ultimately, Bernie didn't win because he didn't have a message that resonated with enough people of color and women who were not millennials. His base among young people was diverse and strong, and it was women and men, and it was blacks and Latinos and white people. But when it came to older generations, many people believed that Bernie thought economics solves everything. And Bernie reminded people of every white guy Marxist who just said, first we'll have the revolution and then we'll worry about your petty little things. Even though actually I don't think that is Bernie, but we've all had experiences with that guy. And there was not enough of a holistic analysis that really showed how particularly race has been used as a wedge to divide people in the United States, not just the United States, but at every point at which there would have been a winning progressive coalition. And there is a history to be told that is absolutely coherent about the centrality of racism, and I believe misogyny as well, in the capitalist experience in the United States. This is an economy that was founded on stolen people and stolen land, right? It doesn't need to be an add-on. It is foundational. So this thing of, oh yeah, we'll add the part about race afterwards, we'll add the part about gender afterwards. It doesn't have to be that way. And the big lesson that I took away from the Bernie campaign is that we can win. If we do this right, and we build a truly diverse movement, and that does not mean building a white movement and then going, where are all the people of color? Let's go reach out to them. It means actually building a diverse movement from the very beginning and lifting up the voices of the most marginalized in society. Then we can win. Because the people Bernie didn't reach are not more right-wing than Bernie. And so I found actually that really transformational to understand, and it's why I'm not hopeless.
Thank you, Naomi. Before exploring how we will win, thanks to this sequence, we understand how we get here. Now, how can we prepare ourselves to the next with Trump? He refused first the climate accord of Paris, his intention with North Korea, a lot of shocks. What from the shock doctrine can we take to prepare ourselves to next trauma or chaos?
Well, to be honest, I mean, one of the things that really spurred me to write the book as quickly as I did is I really wanted the book to be out in the United States before there was a major external crisis. And, you know, I think Trump is a crisis in and of himself, and there's the daily shocks of his Twitter feed. But what I'm really concerned about is that his policies make external shocks more likely, right? He's deregulating the financial sector. That makes another crash like 2008 more likely. So what would the configuration of characters around him do? Like those 5 former Goldman Sachs executives, what would they do to exploit a financial crisis? That's a pretty chilling thought. So we need to not be surprised by that. We need to be able to see it coming. One of the things I wrote about was what people in his administration did during Hurricane Katrina, like Pence, who played an absolutely central role in pushing for the privatization of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Now we're seeing them do the same thing in Puerto Rico, pushing for privatization of the electricity system and the road system. And, you know, I mean, Puerto Rico is a beautiful island with a lot of valuable real estate. You can imagine what a guy like Trump, who makes his living off of luxury resorts, would like Puerto Rico to be, right? And this is the real fear, is that people, the situation in Puerto Rico is so dire that people are being forced to leave. And as the island becomes depopulated, it's very hard for people to protect their interests, as was the case in New Orleans. But I think people are prepared, like people are responding so much quicker. I mean, we already got the contract canceled. They handed out this corrupt contract to a politically connected company called Whitefish to rebuild the electricity grid. This is a company with no experience with this kind of thing, and there was so much pushback that that ended up being canceled. You know, one of the things that really spurred me, what I was going to say, to write the book was the experience actually of having been in this city just days after the horrific terrorist attacks, and being here for the weeks afterwards during COP21, and watching the Hollande government ban protests and declare the state of emergency, and then seeing the state of emergency extended and extended. And obviously the double standards for where the state of emergency was imposed, right? Banning political protests, but not, you know, Christmas markets and sporting events and the various types of events that had been targeted, right? So after Trump tried to impose the travel ban the first time, and there were those amazing protests at the airports, right? We all saw that, and I think took a lot of heart from seeing the way people poured out of their homes, immediately went to the airports, stood with the people who were being detained, and that encouraged local politicians and lawyers and judges to show up, and eventually the court struck down the travel ban. But all I could think about was, if there was a terrorist attack in the United States, they would ban those protests, right? And the courts would not have this courage. And so I really wanted to raise that alarm, because I think that the more we see this stuff coming, the less time we spend in shock, the more we're able to respond, you know? So one of the things I do in the book is give examples of societies that did see it coming, were able to read the signs, did flood the streets when states of emergency were declared from Argentina to Spain, and were able to repel these types of cynical shock doctrine attempts to seize people's rights in those moments of trauma and panic. Climate, you know, one of the things that one of the most heartening moments, I think, of the first few months of Trump's administration was when he announced that he was pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord because he was elected by the people of Pittsburgh, not the people of Paris. Do you remember that? And then the next day, the mayor of Pittsburgh, who's a very progressive guy, pointed out that the people of Pittsburgh had voted for Hillary Clinton, and then he pledged to get Pittsburgh to fossil-free, 100% fossil-free by 2035, which is one of the most ambitious targets in the country. And I think that that response exactly embodies how we all need to respond to Trump, right? I mean, yes, a very dangerous cast of characters controls some very powerful levers, but they do not control everything, right? And precisely because they are so powerful, we all need to do so much more in all of the spaces that they don't control, whether that's cities and states not controlled by Republicans in the United States, or whether it is cities outside the United States like Paris, or sovereign countries outside of the United States. I mean, we can either respond to him in this, well, you know, I'm better than Trump, look at the great meme I sent out, right? And just sort of doing the absolute bare minimum to benefit from being better than Trump. Or we can actually get real and get serious in response to this threat and do a whole lot more than we were doing before Trump, right? And that's what the mayor of Pittsburgh did. And frankly, I see something similar even in this outpouring of the Me Too outpouring and the ways in which women and men are responding to sexual assault and sexual harassment and rampant sexism in our workplaces, in our organizations, in our neighborhoods, in our communities of friends, in our families, you know. I think part of what's going on is like we know we can't control everything, and there is a sexual predator, or a guy who brags about being a sexual predator in the White House, and that is something that for now can't be controlled, but that does not mean that this has to give license to this behavior, and in fact it is possible for us to rise to this occasion and demand more from ourselves. And I think there's a lot of that happening in really inspiring ways, although it's tremendously difficult.
Thank you to move to this, because actually we discussed a little about politics, economics, social issues, and here we are talking about values, about culture, behaviors. Crises and shocks are good ingredients for dystopian literature or dystopian movies, talking about the future with fear. You were mentioning in your book about a crisis of imagination. Could you describe more?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, well, first of all, I should say that I see Trump as dystopian art. Like that's actually the way I think we should see him, not as a shock, but just like, you know, it's what dystopian art is supposed to do, right? Present us with an exaggerated, grotesque version of our world in the future, right? That sort of it looks like us, but worse, right? Like a lot worse. And then you look at it in horror and say, no, I don't want that. I'm going to change. That's why artists make dystopian art, not to give us a roadmap of where we should go, but to warn us that if we stay on this road, this is where we'll end up, right? And so I mean, I think we can metabolize Trump as dystopian art and respond in that way. But one of the things that I worry about is that there is such a mania for dystopian fiction as a response to Trump. That you know the bestseller lists were crowded with these dystopian classics like 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale, and I had felt long before that one of the problems we have is that we can't imagine a future that isn't dystopian, that we face this, that we are in this endless tape loop where we're constantly imagining and reimagining different variations on the same theme that casts our near future as one of unavoidable ecological collapse, unavoidable massively deepened inequality where there's a tiny group of winners and hordes of locked out losers, you know, whether it's the Hunger Games or Children of Men or Elysium or pretty much any, you know, like Hollywood sci-fi movie you could list, although I love Children of Men, I shouldn't put it in that category. And Alfonso Cuarón says it's not about the future, it's right now. The future is unevenly distributed, is what Alfonso says. It's already here, depending on where you live. So I think what the greatest success of neoliberalism is not the policies that it managed to export in all of our countries, but really the success of the war on the imagination embodied in Margaret Thatcher's famous phrase that there is no alternative, and underlined by Francis Fukuyama's End of History, right? That there is nothing outside of the bleak borders of neoliberalism, and this represents indeed the end point of human evolution. And that was a ravaging of our collective imagination. And this is why, you know, I called the book No Is Not Enough, because I think part of the reason why the movements that I've been a part of, I mean, my first book was called No Logo, and, you know, so many of the movements that I've been a part of, though not all of them, have been very good at saying no, enough, drawing the line, you know, whether it is against pipelines or whether it is against terrible free trade deals or whether it is against brutal austerity programs. But when it came to actually articulating the world after we win, the world we want, we have been less good at that. And you know, when I wrote the shock doctrine, I really did believe that just saying no to these brutal opportunistic tactics would be enough to stop them. You know, when Alfonso made the short film, when Alfonso Cuarón made a short film to go with the shock doctrine, the slogan was, information is shock resistance, arm yourselves. Like, we thought that if we just understood the way this tactic worked, people would expose it and resist it. But that book came out in 2007, and then the 2008 financial crisis happened, and then we all said no, you know. I mean, and particularly in Europe, there, you know, people occupied squares for months and resisted with tremendous courage. But often it was just the no, and it was not the, and then what? You know, and in fact, I had an argument with Alexis Tsipras where he told me that no was enough. And I was, you know, sort of making the argument that, you know, I thought that Greece should seize this moment to put forward a much more radical vision for a different kind of economy that was grounded in ecological economics, that was connecting the dots between climate change and the refugee crisis and inequality. And he really said this is a moment of rejection. And I really do believe that that mindset is part of what has kept us in this place. So, yeah, I mean, I think the good news is that young people today, the young people who came of age post-2008 never got the ideological hard sell that my generation got and that yours got. And I think they're freer to imagine that another world is actually doable.
Thank you. My last two questions. I keep this perspective of methodology of dystopian and utopian scenario. This year we had another strong demonstration with the Black Snake in Standing Rock. What could we keep from the Native Amerindian tradition, wisdom, and concrete riot over there?
Well, I think there's a lot to learn, and that I think the resistance against that pipeline is a really wonderful example of a movement that that had to say no. And we you know, I'm not saying that no is unnecessary. I mean, we are up against incredibly dangerous forces, and we have to resist them, whether it is, you know, Nazis in the streets, or whether it is oil pipelines that cannot be built if we are going to have a chance at a safe planet, or, you know, the treatment of refugees in Europe right now. I mean, this needs a no. But we have to find a way that is where in our resistance we are pivoting somewhere else, somewhere safer. Because if we win every one of these defensive battles, then the best case scenario is we end up exactly where we are. And that is not good enough. That's not good enough. So in Standing Rock, I happened to be there when they won this really major victory against the pipeline, when Obama denied the permit. And it was really wonderful because immediately, I mean, people didn't waste any time just celebrating and saying we won. The very next sentence was, okay, now we have to turn Standing Rock into a beacon of the next economy, 100% renewable, agroecological, and rooted in indigenous knowledge and wisdom. Those camps, in many ways, were, I think, for a lot of people, a kind of a school where people were exposed. A lot of people were exposed. A lot of non-indigenous people were exposed to a worldview that is different from the one they grew up with, that we grew up with, and I happen to think is our only hope of moving from this extractive economy, which extracts endlessly from the earth and endlessly from workers and endlessly from communities as if there is no consequence, to a society that is based on caretaking and regeneration, the duty to take care when you to take care of the cycles of regeneration in our own bodies, in our communities, in the natural world. And I think we caught a glimpse of that in that Indigenous-led movement. And the truth is, you see it in every Indigenous-led movement that, you know, I've ever been privileged to be a part of. So I think that's an example of the no and the yes woven together. But I think our challenge now is really one of connecting the dots between so many different issues. Because I do think we've made a lot of progress in a lot of our spaces of getting beyond just the no, just the resistance. I mean, I know that you know from your work in agriculture that there's been so, you know, that it's well beyond the just anti, and there's a vision for how things should work, and lots of living examples of it, right? And the climate movement more and more is a movement that is fighting for 100% renewable energy, fighting for community-controlled renewable energy, fighting for climate justice so that the people who have had their lands ravaged by extraction, who have the dirtiest industries in their backyard, are the first to own and control their own renewable energy. So this is, you know, the foundation of the climate justice movement. What I think we're still not good enough at is getting out of our silos, out of our issue silos. And this is another one of the legacies of neoliberalism, is that we tend to think in issues instead of really having a picture of the world, you know. We're very compartmentalized. So that's my obsession, is like, how do we break down these silos?
Thank you. In the Native American tradition, there is this mantra, Mitakuyo Yasin, which means we are all one, we are all connected. There is a prophecy from Canada, the Anishinaabe prophecy of the Seven Fire, which says that one day, when the earth will go very, very in a mess, a new kind of warriors, an Anglo warrior will come, show up, peaceful warrior, unlikely warrior, with 360.org or with the leap. Somehow, you are also a new kind of warrior. Could you describe how work the LEAP manifesto and 350.org? And how can we be peaceful warrior ourselves?
Well, I would just say I actually live on Anishinaabe territory. I'm a guest on Anishinaabe territory. So the Anishinaabe warriors are the Anishinaabe warriors where I live. The LEAP Manifesto, I end the book with a chapter on this experiment that I was a part of. I talked about it the last time I was in Paris. Maybe some of you heard me talk about it. Right now, as we meet, there's a meeting in Los Angeles to have a LEAP Los Angeles, where they're rewriting the manifesto. It's led by a city councilor. Another radical city, even in polluted Los Angeles, there's a city councilor who's decided that Los Angeles should get to 100% renewable energy very, very quickly, using some of the money that they're getting because they have the Summer Olympics, and they have a lot of money coming in to spend on infrastructure. He read the LEAP Manifesto and realized that this is a discussion that cannot just be left to environmentalists, that indigenous people have to be in the room, that immigrant communities have to be in the room, that justice has to be baked in. And so they're having their meeting. I'm sort of stressed about it right now, because when we had our first meeting a couple of years ago in Canada, it's such hard work, honestly, to get in a room of people who, where there's real differences, you know, to have Greenpeace and the union representing oil workers in the same room. You know, it's hard. There are hard conversations that happen. With the LEAP, I think the LEAP is a short people's manifesto. It's 1,400 words. I included the text at the end of the book, but you can also read it online. You can go to theleap.org and see different examples of what we call the living LEAP. So trade unions that have taken it and reimagined their workplaces with it, or a city council, a group of people who are running for city council on a platform that was inspired by the LEAP Manifesto. It's a vision for caring for the earth and for each other, radical caretaking. Part of what, you know, in addition to that climate justice element, which we call for, we also called for a total redefinition of what a green job is, what a climate job is, that it's not only the wonderful jobs that we can create in renewable energy and public transit and energy efficiency, it's also repairing the damage we've done to the land. And it's also the work of care, which is overwhelmingly done by women, caring for kids, caring for the elderly, teaching, the work that really strengthens our communities and that is under relentless attack by austerity. This is actually low carbon work that rarely gets recognized as low carbon work. So this is what the LEAP Manifesto is, and there's a big piece on migration as well. And it just came out of this attempt to dream together, having a very broad coalition and doing something we'd never done before, which is trying to picture the world after we win and to write it down. And it's really about a different story, because I think we have a lot of examples of coming together and making lists, like just a list of policies that we want. And I think that our crisis is deeper. Our crisis is one of narrative, that we have a culture that is based on this, this taking and then throwing away, whether we're treating the earth like garbage or whether we're treating people like garbage and throwing them away in prisons or refugee camps. And what we need is a culture where no one and nowhere is thrown away. No one is garbage. Nowhere is garbage. I mean, this is another way of talking about the circular economy, but it's really, it's an economy based on cherishing. And so that's what the LEAP is. And we have tools on our website for anybody who wants to start a local LEAP group. More than anything, I think it's about not waiting for politicians to lead us. It's about coming up with our non-negotiables and then saying to any politician that wants to call themselves a populist that they need to follow the people.
Just before listening to the people, I would like to explore a few seconds of silence and attention of the gift that you offer to us tonight. Thank you for this. And we will have 25 minutes for questions, reactions, comments. So, could you raise your hand if you have yet a question, in order that we can manage it? Okay, so like 10 questions. If okay, we will take 3 questions in a row and 1 answer. Let's try to be sharp in order that we could enjoy the biodiversity of reactions. Et vous pouvez poser des questions en français.
Oui.
Ou en anglais, comme vous voulez. En italien, je ne peux pas traduire.
Hi. I wanted to ask you about refugees, particularly about the DACA program. I wanted to know what is happening in the United States about it. Is it cancelled or is it still on? And I know that in France the situation is also quite dramatic, but I really wanted to know what was happening in the United States and what you think also about the fact that we are kind of in every country in Europe treating illegally isolated foreign minors and putting them into illegal establishments. And in France it's happening right now, so I wanted to know what you are thinking about this.
Thank you. We'll take a second question.
Good evening. Very short question. If you had to make a prediction on whether or not Trump is going to make it to the end of his mandate, what would it be and why?
Thank you. And last question for this role.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I have 2 very short questions. The first one is that you talk a lot about renewable, but you haven't used the word less at all, less energy rather than more renewable energy. The second question is, it took over 150 years for the working class movement to organize, as you know, and it took about 10 years for the neoliberalism to dismantle those structures. You talk about reorganizing and reorganization, but what do you propose concretely in terms of reorganization? And do you think that social entrepreneurship can fill that sort of gap and void, whereas it also thrives on neoliberal structures? So there's an ambiguity here.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have 4 questions. We have one about migrants, one about the final mandate, the final episode of the mandate of Trump, the question about less energy, and the last one is how to put into the design and the new design social enterprise.
Those are all great questions. I think I'll work backwards from the last one. The less energy is a very good point. I didn't say it, but I do write it, and I stand corrected, because it is absolutely true that we have to consume less. Not just less energy, but less stuff. We need to contract those parts of our economy that are just based on consumption, mindless consumption. Obviously there are lots of people that need to consume more because they don't have enough, but we also have a culture that is based on overconsumption, and we can't dodge that discussion. This is also part of why I think we have to talk about the parts of our economy that we can expand, right? We can expand the arts, we can expand the caring professions, we can expand those sectors that actually make us happier and are not just about endlessly feeding that void created by the hollow brand.
Actually, in the LIB paradigm, it's about happier context. Huh? It's not just reuse.
Yeah, and you know, one of one of the dots that we need to connect is that there is an epidemic of despair, depression, that has a lot to do with disconnection from our communities, disconnection from one another. We're social creatures. We're spending a lot of time alone staring at screens. Disconnection from nature, disconnection from the things that nourish us, and we need a process of reconnection, which is going to make us happier, and also going to be good for the planet. So what's good for us is good for the planet. It's always good to remember that. Social entrepreneurs. Look, I mean, I think that there is a role for social entrepreneurs, absolutely, and I think there's been some, amazing innovations that make the dream of 100% renewable possible, and a lot of things. I don't believe it is all about the market solving this for us and lowering prices. I think we're also benefiting from the German and Chinese government making massive investments in renewables, but there's no doubt that there's also been some very important market innovation that I think is a key part of the transition. I just don't think it can lead it. But I think it has a role.
Professor Yunus, the Nobel Peace Prize 2006 is organizing a party tomorrow at 6 p.m. Next year. Have you been invited to discuss about social entrepreneurs?
No, but I don't usually get invited to social.
Okay.
Well, I just got invited. So, the question about Trump and the end of his mandate, here's the truth. I don't know. I think it is something that, I'm glad that he's being investigated by Robert Mueller. I'm glad that it seems to be a very thorough investigation and a very serious investigation. But I feel like there's too much political energy that is spent in the United States. I mean, it doesn't really matter what we do here in this room, but I think there's too much political energy spent in the United States just sort of hoping for impeachment, right? Hoping he will not make it to the end of his term for one reason or another, right? Whether he sees impeachment coming, so he quits, or he actually stays and gets impeached. No U.S. president has ever been impeached. Nixon quit before he could be impeached. And so I think we have to prepare for the most likely outcome. And the most likely outcome is, not only does he last out his term, but he runs again, okay? And this is why it is very important not to waste serious political energy. Let Robert Mueller do his job, right? What the rest of us need to do, so I'm speaking for us in North America, is have a political strategy to beat Trump in the next election, okay? And I am worried that that is not happening. Because the election campaign can't be elect Democrats so we impeach Trump. That is a negative campaign, and that is exactly what didn't work the last time around. When Hillary ran a campaign, a lot of which was about how dangerous Trump is, right? So I think there has to be a platform that speaks to the fact that people feel politics is failing them. A lot of people express that by raising the middle finger and voting for Trump, but 90 million Americans express that by staying home, right? So people need something to vote for, and I think what we saw in the UK with Corbyn's campaign was really encouraging, because Corbyn's poll numbers were absolutely terrible. The whole election was called just to wipe Labour out for a generation. It was a completely unnecessary election, and it ended up having this incredibly surprising outcome. The Tories lost their majority, and Labour picked up more votes than they did in any election since the Second World War. And what happened is not that Jeremy Corbyn suddenly became this incredibly charismatic politician. What happened is they came out with a manifesto that spoke to people's actual needs, that mapped out a future, that excited people, and they managed to galvanize a lot of people who don't usually vote. Right? And that's the kind of thing that I think needs to happen if Trump is not going to win a second term. That's what I'm worried about, not whether he's going to last out this term. I'm worried about him getting a second term, for real, okay? And that is where the no yes comes in, right? And, and I think there's something really exciting going on with healthcare, right? Where the Republicans have tried to repeal Obamacare. In response to this, there has been a groundswell in the United States, the largest movement in my lifetime, demanding single-payer universal health care. So, say not only are you not going to dismantle Obamacare, but we're going to demand something better than Obamacare, because the truth is that Obamacare was not good enough, and it had huge giveaways to the insurance industry, and it was vulnerable to these types of attacks. DACA is another example of this, right? Where DACA is the program, for those of you who don't know, that gave temporary protection, allowed young people to work in the United States on the basis that it was young immigrants, that it was not their fault that they were illegal, because their parents had brought them to the United States when they were young, okay? So the whole discourse around DACA is good immigrant versus bad immigrant. And it pits young people against their parents in a way that's really cruel. That's really, really cruel. And it implies that somehow their parents did something terrible by trying to bring their families to safety for whatever the reason it was, whether economic, ecological, military. And so we're seeing a lot of this, and the answer to your question is that DACA is still uncertain. It's very much in limbo, so there's no simple answer to that question. But what's been really moving to me is watching these young people who are DACA recipients who've benefited from this program, they call themselves streamers, getting arrested, opposing the attacks on DACA, but then saying, DACA is not good enough, in the same way that Obamacare is not good enough. We want our parents to be legal. We want our whole families to be legal. We're going for status for all, right? And this is the kind of no, but we want better stance that I think we need to see in many different areas. And young immigrants in the United States are leading on this in incredibly courageous ways, taking huge risks in the process. You asked about what's happening in Europe with migrants, which is a pretty huge question. I'm very disturbed by what's happening. I'm particularly disturbed by this increasing trend of trying to force migrants back into extremely unsafe situations, working with repressive regimes to send people essentially to concentration camps, which is pretty much what Australia has done. And right now there's an uprising on Manus Island as we speak, which is one of these island detention or concentration camps that the Australian government has put in place with this policy of intervening, of intercepting the boats and sending people directly. And I think Europe is increasingly going in this direction. And I think it violates international law on multiple fronts, and it's an atrocity. It's an atrocity.
Thank you, Naomi. Do we have other questions? I will move to this side. This side?
Hello, thank you very much for your work. I was wondering, according to you, what is the top 3 action to maximize our impact on our residents and protecting the environment?
Thank you.
To maximize our impact to protect the environment and our residents, our political actions.
Okay. Hello, thank you for tonight. It's become more and more obvious how corrupt the political system is today by the neoliberalism corporations. So my question is, how do we lead resistance without breaking the rules, without civil disobedience? Can it really work if we have to follow the rules, if the rules are not made for us and by us?
Yeah.
Just to sum up, we have economical crisis, refugee or concentration camps. We also have a lot of problems with politics and democracy. Doesn't remind you of something at the beginning of the 19th century? Or the 20th? Do you think it's plausible that there will be another Third World War? You?
As economists and mostly as humans, what do you think about our presidents who want to take the climate leadership when his action is not in harmony with his work?
Say it again en français.
Que pensez-vous en tant qu'économiste et surtout en tant que personne humaine vivant sur cette terre, Que pensez-vous de notre président qui proclame et souhaite avoir le leadership climatique alors que dans ses actes, il continue à financer le fossile, à sucrer les subventions, le bio, tout ça. S'il le sait pas.
Yeah.
Merci. So we have 4 questions about individual autonomous. Comment on redevient résilient à un niveau individuel? Comment est-ce qu'on peut faire sans désobéir civilement?
Okay, I'm going to try to be speed round. So I think if we're talking about lowering our individual carbon footprint, the most important thing you could not do is what I did to get here, which is fly. And it's pretty important not to eat meat as well to lower your carbon footprint. You live in a city with great public transit, so you should use it. And there are lots of other things that we can do as individuals. And many of those things will make us healthier if we walk more, if we bike more, and if we eat less meat, be healthier, right? But I would just say that we can't mistake those individual things that lower our carbon footprint for actually being solutions to the climate crisis at this late stage in the game. That if we're serious about meeting the targets that our government set in Paris, which are actually pretty scary. We've warmed the planet by 1 degree, and look at what we have just seen with hurricanes, record-breaking superstorms, forest fires around the world, and that's 1 degree, and we said we're going to keep temperatures below 2 degrees or make best efforts to 1.5, right? So if we're going to do that, we have to do a lot more than any of our governments are saying, right? So this is something we can't do without policy. But I would say join your friends at 350 block any attempts to expand fossil fuel infrastructure, because that is absolutely incompatible with any of the pledges made in Paris. But we also need to fight for policy solutions that are the yes. So yeah, we just say there are lots of individual things we can do, but the individual stuff is not going to get us there. On civil disobedience, I mean, I do believe that that civil disobedience has always played a very important role in any serious movement for social change. I don't believe in violence. I believe in non-violent civil disobedience, and I also believe in accountable civil disobedience. And I think that it's very important for people who decide to take that step to really interrogate who they're accountable to and who they're putting at risk. Because there are definitely examples of people sort of just deciding with 3 friends that they're going to do something, and then the implications of that decision are felt by people who are much more vulnerable. And so I would say I believe in accountable nonviolent civil disobedience, but I do believe it's indispensable. Are we starting the 3rd World War? Look, I mean, I think Trump is doing his best, tweeting threats of nuclear annihilation, and I do think that we need to be ready, and we need to connect the dots between so many of the crises we face, including the fact that so much of the migration that is happening now, the forced migration, is blowback from illegal wars that many of our governments participated. Maybe not your government. My government did. And so I don't really know how to answer the question about, I mean, do I actually think it's going to happen? I think we need to be prepared. We need to rebuild an anti-war movement, which we haven't had for a while. But it can't be the same kind of anti-war movement that doesn't connect the dots between climate change, between migration, between inequality. It has to be much more holistic. We live in this time of multiple overlapping crises. So we cannot be single issue in anything we do. We have to have a holistic vision in everything we do, right? We can't claim my crisis is bigger than your crisis, whether it's climate change or nuclear annihilation or fighting racism and misogyny. It's all a 5-alarm fire, okay? If you are on the front lines, it's a 5-alarm fire. So we just can't. That's all.
How to help him to be consistent with everything.
Look, I mean, one thing, a couple of things I would just say about my call. I think I am very alarmed by the way in which the last election in France was sort of treated like some kind of great victory for centrism, okay? It was an incredibly frightening outcome. It was incredibly frightening. And to turn around after that election result, after seeing the steady increase on the Front National in this country, to then turn around and create and recreate and deepen precisely the economic conditions under which fascism spreads, which we know historically and which we've seen again and again in country after country after country since 2008, is reckless endangerment, and he needs to be held accountable for this. And when we fight austerity, we're fighting racism. We are, because this is the soil in which fascism spreads. It's not the only, we also have to fight racism directly, but we have to understand the connections. In terms of what he says about the environment, I mean, we're in a similar situation in Canada with Trudeau, right? Where he's really great with the messaging and the memes, you know? And the truth is, that's a better situation to be in than the opposite. You know, and having a leader who doesn't make the claims at all and denies that climate change is real or downplays it. You know, I think that Macron's gone quite far out on a limb on wanting to be seen as a climate leader, and that is a fantastic tool for the climate movement to use, right? I think that if this is the brand he's chosen, hold him to it, and that's much easier to do than what our friends in the United States are up against.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Maybe we have just one space for just one last question. Qui est né le 3 novembre? Est-ce qu'il y a un anniversaire? Non?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm very puzzled by the fact that we are all at this very moment using Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and devices that are being built in China by people who are suffering terrible working conditions. And my question is, how do we get our ideas without using the corporate technological devices and devices that are using fossil fuel energy? Thank you.
And, Olivia, there's somebody in the front row who's really
Thank you for your expose. Great. Just great. And I want to know how to fight. How would you fight? How would you fight against fake news, which are like manipulating people first, because they stimulate dreams our people have, and how can we be against that? How can we fight?
Thank you. I hope that we will come back to France for a new edition of conférences. For these two questions.
Well, I think on fake news, you know, I think that the soil in which fake news grows is a population that hasn't been taught critical thinking. That you know, I think if we continue to underfund education, then this is going to spread even more. So I think supporting education, having particular programs where young people are taught to decode it. I think there are some interesting programs that are emerging, which encourages young people to spread their findings and share when they expose something. But I also think we need to be regulating these companies more, right? I think that Facebook and Google and Twitter and all of them have had an incredible free ride for a very long time. They've gotten incredibly wealthy. And they, you know, they're going to end up having to be treated like public utilities at a certain point. So I haven't totally figured this out, but I think there is some good thinking that is emerging, and I do think that critical thought can get us part of the way there, but I also think we're going to just need standards in the same way that we have standards about what you can put on television, and that you can't, you know, just lie in an advertisement, and that there are ways to lodge a grievance if people are just saying untrue things. I mean, if this is where we're getting our information, we have to have mechanisms. In terms of the devices, I agree with you that it is, you know, I think our relationship to our devices are alarming on many levels. I think that that certainly the labor condition piece of it is alarming, and the built-in obsolescence piece of it is alarming. And this is one area in which we can buy less and not fall for the latest campaign to get us to throw out our old phones. I also think there's things that we can do, you know, I mean, even just like simple things that Europe has done around not, you know, having to get a new charger for every device because they keep changing them, right? I mean, we tend to assume that there's nothing we can do to tackle built-in obsolescence in the technology sector, that we just have to let them do it, but I'm not sure that that is true. But I also think that, you know, I end the book, as you know, again, with I have a passage about how, you know, because Trump is nuclear-armed dystopian art, that we need to see him as a warning. And part of seeing him as a warning is looking inside of ourselves to find our inner Trump. Right? The Trump within. And, you know, I mean, this is a guy who is addicted to Twitter. He can't read, you know, an intelligence brief, let alone a book. He needs to be handed everything in a list, which is basically what our media is turning into, because so many of us seem to need to read everything in lists. So, I mean, he shows these exaggerated forms of so many things that are going wrong in our culture, and one of them is the addiction, you know, to those dopamine hits that we get from these technologies, which also encourage us to attack each other instead of talking to each other, to go nuclear on each other at the first provocation, and also, you know, to see ourselves as brands and curate our lives, our own mini reality TV shows that we're broadcasting from our phones all the time. So I'm not saying, you know, that we should just throw them out the window, although sometimes I think that would be a good idea. But I do think we need a much, much healthier relationship with technology, where we use these incredible tools as tools, including as tools for our movements to get us together very quickly, but to get us in rooms with one another where we can look each other in the eye and develop systems of accountability. Workers in China need trade unions.
Merci, Naomi.